The candles in the steward's receiving hall had been burning low all morning, their flames small and disinterested. They changed the moment Ivy Thornbeck walked in. She didn't notice. She was too busy slamming her father's tax receipts onto the polished oak desk hard enough to rattle the inkwell, her pulse hammering in her throat, and flour dust still clinging to the creases of her sleeves. The steward, a thin, pinch-faced man named Alderman, flinched. "These are stamped." Ivy's voice shook, but not from fear, from the effort of keeping it level. "Paid in full, every quarter for the last 6 years. My father never missed a single payment, and you seized his land 3 weeks after we put him in the ground." Alderman adjusted his spectacles. He did not look at the receipts. "Miss Thornbeck, the Lord's records indicate—" "The Lord's records are wrong." She'd rehearsed this. Practiced it in the mirror above the millstone, her reflection dusty and determined. She'd walked 7 miles in the dark to arrive before the manor gates opened, her boots wearing thin at the soles, her jaw set so tight her back teeth ached. She had not come here to be managed. Alderman sighed. He folded his hands on the desk with the particular patience of a man who had dismissed women before and found it easy. "The Lord is not receiving petitions today. I suggest you return next month when Next month the planting season starts. Next month it won't matter if you give the land back because there won't be time to sow it." Ivy pressed her fingertips into the desk. The candle nearest her hand flickered, its flame stretching an inch taller. "I'm not leaving until someone with authority looks at these receipts." That was when the door behind the steward's desk opened, and a woman in a starched white cap appeared. Nell Ashby, the head maid, had the kind of face that managed to look simultaneously kind and terrified. Her eyes swept the room, landed on Ivy, and went wide. "You need to leave," Nell whispered. She crossed the room in 3 quick steps and took Ivy's arm. "Now. Right now." Ivy pulled free. "I've been waiting since dawn. I'm not—" "You don't understand." Nell's voice dropped even lower, urgent and strained. "He's here. The king. He arrived an hour ago without any warning, and he's walking the grounds, and if he finds you in here making a scene, it'll be worse for all of us. Please." Her grip tightened. "Leave before he sees you." Ivy's stomach dropped. The Alpha King. Here. At this minor lord's estate in the middle of nowhere. The timing felt like a cruel joke. The one morning she'd finally worked up the nerve, and the most powerful man in the 5 kingdoms had decided to inspect a vassal's property. She gathered her receipts with shaking hands. Fine. She'd come back. She'd come back every day for a year if she had to, but she would not risk. "Sees who?" The voice came from behind her. Low and unhurried. The kind of voice that didn't need volume to fill a room. Every candle in the hall surged. Ivy watched it happen. All 6 flames leaping at once, stretching tall and bright as if a wind had blown through the room, except there was no wind. The wax pooled and the light doubled, and for one disorienting heartbeat, the entire receiving hall blazed gold. She turned around. He stood in the doorway that led to the manor's interior corridor. One shoulder braced against the stone frame, arms crossed. He was tall. Taller than any man she'd seen in Ashwick Village, with deep auburn hair pushed carelessly off his forehead, falling just past his jaw in a way that suggested he'd been riding hard and hadn't bothered to fix it. His riding coat was forest green, dark as pine needles, and travel-worn at the elbows. Mud still clung to his boots, but it was his eyes that stopped her. Burnished copper, warm and sharp at the same time, like a coin held up to firelight. They were fixed on her with an intensity that made her lungs forget how to work. Something in Ivy's chest pulled, a thread she hadn't known existed, drawn suddenly taut, and warmth, not from the candles, not from the room, spread through her ribs like someone had pressed a lit match to the inside of her sternum. She took a step back. The candle on the desk dimmed, he noticed. She watched his gaze flick to the flame, then back to her. And something shifted in his expression. A slight narrowing of those copper eyes. A stillness that hadn't been there before. Nell had gone rigid beside her. Alderman was already on his feet, bowing so deeply his spectacles slid down his nose. "Your Majesty, I wasn't aware you'd—" "I was walking the east corridor and heard someone say my name." The stranger, the king, pushed off the doorframe and stepped into the room. Every step closer made the candles burn brighter. "I tend to investigate when that happens." His eyes hadn't left Ivy's face. "You were discussing receipts." It wasn't a question. Ivy's tongue felt thick. This was the Alpha King, Aemon Kestrel. The man whose laws governed her village, whose signature sat at the bottom of every land charter in the realm, whose reputation preceded him in stories she'd half believed. He was supposed to be untouchable, distant, a figure from council proclamations and tax headers. He was not supposed to be standing 6 feet away from her with mud on his boots and curiosity in his eyes. She stopped, swallowed. Her father's voice surfaced from somewhere deep in her memory, steady and flower-dusted, the way it had always been. "Don't let them see you waver, Ivy Vine. If you're right, stand like you're right." She lifted her chin. "Yes, I was discussing receipts. Because the Lord's men seized my father's land 3 weeks after he passed, claiming unpaid taxes. These—" She held up the papers, and was furious to see her hand trembling. "These prove every payment was made. I've been trying to get someone to look at them for a month." Aemon's gaze dropped to the papers, then to Alderman, who had gone the color of cold porridge. "You've been turning her away," the king said. Not a question either. Alderman's mouth opened and closed. "The Lord's schedule doesn't permit—" "Show me." 2 words, spoken quietly. But Alderman flinched like he'd been struck, and Nell drew a sharp breath beside Ivy, and something in the air changed. The same something that had made the candles leap. Ivy felt it in her chest again. That pull, that warmth, like a flame being fed. She handed the receipts to the Alpha King. His fingers brushed hers when he took them. The candle on the desk flared so bright that Alderman stumbled backward, and Ivy felt the contact everywhere. A rush of heat that started at her fingertips and poured through her wrist, up her arm, into her shoulder and down through her ribs, until it pooled low in her stomach like swallowed embers. Her breath caught. His eyes widened, just barely, and she saw it. The moment he felt it too. The way his jaw tightened. The way his hand stayed exactly where it was, holding the papers and her gaze at the same time. Then he stepped back, and the room dimmed, and Ivy could breathe again. Aemon studied the receipts in the muted candlelight. His expression gave nothing away, but she watched his thumb trace the stamped seal on the 3rd page, the one her father had been proudest of, the one that covered the quarter when the river flooded and half the village couldn't pay. "These are legitimate," he said. "I know they are." He looked up at her. There was something in his expression she couldn't name, something careful and searching, as if she were a document in a language he was still learning to read. "What's the land used for?" "Wheat. And there's a mill." Her voice steadied, finding its footing on familiar ground. "My father built it himself. Took him 4 years. It feeds most of Ashwick during the winter months." "And now?" "And now it's sitting empty because the Lord's steward padlocked the gate and told me I had no claim." Her hands curled at her sides. "My father is barely cold in the ground and they've locked me out of the only thing he left me." The room went quiet. Nell was staring at the floor. Alderman was staring at the king. The king was staring at Ivy with those burnished copper eyes, and the candles had gone perfectly, impossibly still, their flames upright and unflickering, as if the air itself was holding its breath. "Show me the mill," Aemon said. She blinked. "What?" "The mill. The land. I want to see it." Alderman made a strangled sound. "Your Majesty, the Lord has a luncheon prepared and the accounts review is scheduled for—" "The accounts can wait." Aemon folded the receipts carefully and tucked them inside his riding coat. Miss Thornbeck, if you're willing to walk 7 miles back, I'd like to walk them with you. Ivy stared at him. Every sensible instinct she had, every lesson she'd learned about powerful men and their unreliable promises, told her to take the receipts, say thank you, and disappear. To handle this herself, the way she'd handled everything since her father's chest went still on that cold Tuesday morning, and the world shrank down to a mill she couldn't reach and a grief she couldn't outrun. But the candles were leaning toward him, all of them, tilting on their iron stands like flowers following the sun, their flames angled in his direction, and something in her chest was doing the same thing. "It's 7 miles through the woods," she said. "The road washed out last week." He looked down at his mud-spattered boots, looked back at her, almost smiled. "I think I'll manage." They walked. The forest path from Glenmore Manor to Ashwick wound through old-growth oaks and across 2 stone bridges, the canopy overhead thick enough to filter the midday sun into pale green ribbons. Ivy set a pace designed to prove she didn't need anyone to slow down for her. Eamon matched it without comment. He walked beside her, not behind, and he didn't try to take her arm when she stumbled over a root or when the path narrowed to single file between 2 fallen birches. She noticed that. She noticed everything about him and hated herself for it. The way his coat moved when he walked. The way he scanned the tree line, not with anxiety but with the automatic awareness of a man accustomed to being responsible for everything in his field of vision. The way he shortened his stride just enough to stay level with her without making it obvious. "You walk fast," he said after the first mile. "I walk the speed I walk. You're free to fall behind." He almost smiled. She saw it. The twitch at the corner of his mouth, quickly controlled. "I'll manage." The pull in her chest hadn't faded. If anything, it intensified the longer they walked. A low hum of warmth that deepened every time their shoulders nearly touched on the narrow path. She could feel him beside her like a banked hearth. Not blazing, not demanding attention, but radiating something steady that her body kept turning toward against her will. When they passed a mossy stump where a tallow candle had been left by a forester, the dead wick burst into flame as they walked by. Ivy stopped, stared at it. The flame burned clean and bright, as if it had been waiting. She looked at Eamon. He was already looking at her. "That's been happening since the receiving hall," he said quietly. "The candles. I don't know what it is. I think you do." She did. Somewhere beneath the grief and the anger and the 7-mile ache in her calves, she knew exactly what it was. The old women in Ashwick whispered about it. The bond, the pull, the fire that found its match. She'd thought it was a children's tale, a story her father used to tell when the millstone was turning and the flower dust hung in the air like snow. Her father. The memory hit without warning. She was 12, sitting on the mill floor with her knees drawn up, watching him sort receipts by candlelight. His hands were steady and flower-dusted, always flower-dusted, and he laid each stamped paper flat with the care of a man arranging precious things. "Why do you keep them all?" she'd asked. He'd smiled, that quiet, tired smile. "Because someday, someone might try to tell you this isn't yours, Ivy Vine. And when they do, you'll have the proof in your hands." He'd tap the stack. Paper doesn't forget, even when people choose to. She hadn't cried since the funeral. She'd decided, somewhere between the burial and the padlocked gate, that crying was a luxury for people who had someone to hold them afterward. She was not going to start now, on a forest path, in front of the Alpha King. But her eyes burned, and her voice cracked when she said, "The mill is another mile." Eamon didn't comment on the crack. He didn't offer comfort or platitudes or the hollow sympathy she'd come to expect from people who hadn't lost the only person who'd ever fought for them. He just shifted half a step closer so their arms were almost touching and walked. The warmth between them steadied her like a hand at her back. The mill sat at the bend of Ashwick Creek, its wheel still and its door chained shut. Ivy hadn't been inside in over a month. She stood in front of it and felt the absence like a wound. No creak of the wheel turning, no rhythmic thud of stone on stone, no flour dust drifting through slanted light. Just silence, and a padlock, and a chain that didn't belong there. Eamon studied the lock, then the wheel, then the creak, which ran clean and steady despite the neglect. He walked the perimeter of the building slowly, running his hand along the timber frame, and Ivy watched him and tried to understand why this man, this king, was touching her father's walls like they mattered. "He built this well," Eamon said. "He built everything well." Her voice was steady again. "He said the mill would outlast him. He was right about that, at least." Eamon turned. He stood in a patch of afternoon sunlight, and the light caught his hair and turned the auburn to something close to flame, and Ivy felt the pull in her chest so strongly that she pressed her hand flat against her sternum to keep it inside. "The seizure was illegal," he said. "I've seen enough. I'll issue a reversal order before I leave Glenmore." She should have felt relief. She did feel relief, a loosening in her chest that she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. But something else surfaced alongside it. Something sharp and suspicious, and born from a month of being told no. "Why?" He blinked. "Because the law is clear, you have proof of payment. The seizure has no legal basis." "No." She stepped closer, the candle in the mill's window, the one she'd left burning the day they locked her out. Now long dead, flickered to life. "Why did you walk 7 miles to look at a mill? You could have issued the order from the steward's desk. You didn't need to see this. You didn't need to see me." The words came out harder than she intended, but she didn't take them back. She needed to understand. She'd spent a month learning that no one did anything without a price, and kindness from powerful men came with invoices she couldn't afford. Eamon was quiet for a long moment. The creek moved behind him. The candle in the window burned steady and bright between them. "Because when you slammed those receipts on that desk," he said, "every candle in the room reached for you. And I have been looking for the person who does that to flame for longer than I want to admit." He paused. His voice dropped lower. "And because you looked at me like I was just another man who would fail you, and I—" He stopped, swallowed, started again. "I wanted to not be that." The honesty of it undid something in her, not the anger. The anger was righteous, and she would keep it. But the wall behind the anger, the one she'd built from grief and padlocks, and a month of eating dinner alone in a house that still smelled like her father's soap. "My father would have liked you," she said, and her voice broke on the last word, and this time she didn't fight it. Eamon crossed the space between them in 2 strides. He didn't touch her. He stood close enough that the warmth radiating from his body, or from whatever lived between them, wrapped around her like a second skin, and the candle in the window blazed, and the tears she'd been holding for a month finally came. "Tell me about him," Eamon said. So she did. Standing in her father's millyard with the creek running beside them, she told the Alpha King about a man who kept every receipt, who taught her to read grain quality by touch, who called her Ivy Vine and let her fall asleep on flour sacks while he worked late, and never once made her feel like a burden. And Eamon listened. Not with the polite patience of a king performing kindness, but with the focused stillness of a man who understood that listening was its own form of devotion. When she told him about the morning she found her father still and cold, Eamon's jaw tightened and his hands curled at his sides, and she realized with a start that he was angry. Not at her, for her. When she finished, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of the creek, and the turning of small stones underwater, and the faint hiss of candle wax melting. "My mother passed when I was 9, he said, when she'd gone quiet. His voice was rougher than before, stripped of the authority she'd heard in the steward's hall. "The castle still smells like her garden on warm days. Rosemary and thyme." He looked at the mill. For a long time after, I used to sit in that garden and pretend she'd just gone inside to get something, that she'd come back any moment with dirt on her knees and tell me what she'd planted. He paused. I understand wanting to keep the places they built, the places where they still feel close. Ivy looked at him, really looked, past the title and the authority and the copper eyes, and saw something she recognized. The particular loneliness of someone who had lost the one person who made the world make sense. The candles, the window candle, a lantern hung on a hook by the door, even a taper stub on the fence post. All of them burned tall and gold, leaning toward each other, toward them. Ivy wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. You're going to think I'm someone I'm not. You're going to see the candles and the bond and think I'm something extraordinary. And I need you to know that I'm not. I'm a miller's daughter who can't afford new boots. That's all. Eamon looked at her. The afternoon light was softening toward evening, and in it, his eyes were the color of warm copper, of pennies in a fountain, of the first sparks off a flint. Ivy, he said, and the way he spoke her name made the candle flame bow. You walked 7 miles in the dark to fight for what's yours. You stood in front of a man who could have had you removed and didn't flinch. You brought receipts. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. I don't think you're extraordinary because of candles. She kissed him. She didn't plan it. One moment she was standing in her father's milliard with tears drying on her cheeks, and her heart cracked open like a walnut. And the next she had her hands fisted in the lapels of his riding coat, and her mouth pressed against his, and the world ignited. The warmth that had been humming between them caught. It roared through her like a furnace door thrown open, heat pouring from every point of contact, his hands coming up to cradle her face, her fingers tightening in the worn green fabric, and every candle within sight blazing so bright the milliard looked like midday. She felt it in her chest, in her ribs, in the soles of her worn thin boots. A fire that didn't burn but fed, that didn't consume but completed. And his mouth was warm and tasted like wood smoke and road dust and something achingly gentle beneath the strength. The world narrowed to the press of his palms against her cheeks, and the steady anchoring heat of him, and the sound of the creak, and the crackle of candle flames burning higher than any natural flame should burn. He pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against hers. His breathing was ragged. His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone where the tears had been, slow and deliberate, as if he were memorizing the shape of her. The candle in the window settled into a steady golden glow. I should tell you, he murmured, his voice rough and low, that I'm going to have a very difficult time walking back to Glenmore now. Then don't. He laughed, low and surprised, and the sound moved through her like a second heartbeat. Ivy. I mean it. The reversal order can wait 1 night. It absolutely cannot. But he was smiling, and his hands hadn't left her face, and the candle flames were swaying between them like a slow dance. They walked back to Glenmore as the sun began to set, painting the forest path in shades of amber and rose. Ivy's hand was in his. She hadn't offered it. He hadn't asked. It had simply happened somewhere on the second stone bridge, his fingers finding hers and closing around them with a certainty that made her throat tight. Neither of them spoke much. There was a comfort in the quiet, in the crunch of leaves under their boots, and the distant call of wood thrushes settling for the night, and the steady, extraordinary warmth that flowed between their joined hands like a current. Every candle they passed, Forrester's markers, a shrine lantern at the crossroads, a forgotten taper in an abandoned lean-to, flickered to life and burned until they'd passed. By the time they reached the manor gates, the forest behind them was dotted with tiny flames like a trail of earthbound stars. At the manor, the great hall was lit for the evening meal. The lord, a portly man named Blackwood, who had clearly been scrambling to prepare for a royal visit he'd had no warning of, was seated at the head of the table with his household gathered. Nell stood near the kitchen door, wringing her apron, her eyes round as coins. Eamon walked in with Ivy beside him. He did not let go of her hand. The hall went quiet. 40 sets of eyes, the lords among them, fixed on the Alpha King and the flower-dusted townswoman at his side. "Lord Blackwood?" Eamon's voice filled the hall with effortless authority. "Your steward has been refusing petitions from your tenants. Specifically, he has been turning away a woman with documented proof that her family's land was wrongfully seized." He set the receipts on the table. The candles in the iron chandelier above them flared bright. "I will be issuing a reversal order tonight. The Thornbeck Mill and its surrounding acreage will be returned to its rightful owner immediately." Lord Blackwood sputtered. "Your Majesty, I assure you, I walked the property myself." Eamon's voice didn't rise, but it hardened. The seizure was illegal, the records were forged, and the mill that feeds half your tenants in winter has been sitting locked and empty because someone wanted to add another parcel to your estate. He paused. "Let the silence do its work. That ends tonight." Ivy stood beside him and felt the heat of 40 stares. She felt Nell's eyes on her from the kitchen doorway, wide with something between terror and awe. She felt the candles overhead, burning fierce and tall, leaning toward the place where her shoulder almost touched Eamon's arm. And she felt her father's receipts, finally, in the hands of someone who would honor them. Lord Blackwood opened his mouth, closed it, nodded. Eamon turned to Ivy. In front of the entire hall, he said, "Miss Thornbeck, is there anything else you need?" She looked at him. The copper eyes, the mud-spattered boots, the riding coat she'd crumpled in her fists an hour ago when she'd kissed him in her father's milliard. He was giving her the choice, in front of everyone, not speaking for her, not claiming her, but asking, the way no one had asked her anything in the month since her father died. They'd told her, ordered her, dismissed her. No one had asked. "Just the mill," she said. And then, quieter, only for him. "And maybe the walk back tomorrow." His eyes softened. Something fierce and tender moved through his expression. There and gone. Like flame behind glass. The candles swayed. "Tomorrow," he said. "And the day after that." Nell let out a sound from the kitchen doorway that might have been a laugh or a sob. She pressed her apron to her mouth, and her eyes, when they met Ivy's across the hall, were bright with something that looked like hope. The particular hope of a woman who had spent years watching injustices she couldn't fix, finally seeing one undone. Lord Blackwood stared at his plate. The household murmured and buzzed, and Ivy Thornbeck stood in the center of it all and felt, for the first time in a month, like the ground beneath her feet was hers again. 3 months later, the mill wheel was turning. Ivy stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and flour dust in her hair, watching the late afternoon light fall through the millstone's spray in hazy gold columns. The creek ran high from spring melt. The grain stores were full. The new apprentice, a quiet boy from the village named Rowan, had gone home an hour ago, and the mill had settled into the rhythmic, familiar thrum that Ivy felt in her bones like a second pulse. The padlock and chain had been melted down and reforged into a hinge for the new door. Her idea, and one that had made the blacksmith laugh. "Turning a lock into a welcome," he'd said. She'd liked that. She heard the horse before she saw it. A familiar rhythm on the forest path, unhurried, and then the creak of saddle leather as he dismounted. Eamon Kestrel walked into the millyard the same way he walked everywhere, like the ground was glad to have him. His riding coat was the same dark green, though she suspected it had been brushed since that first day. His boots were clean, his hair was not. "You're early," she said. "I left early." He crossed the yard. "The council session ran long and I couldn't stand another minute of it." "Liar. You love council sessions." "I love being right in council sessions. Today I was outvoted on the bridge tariff." He reached her. His hand found her waist, easy and warm, and the candles she'd set in the mill windows. She kept them burning always now, a habit she'd stopped questioning, stretched tall and gold. I brought you something. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. She opened it and went still. It was a deed, not a reversal order, not a temporary grant. A full land deed to the Thornbeck property, signed and sealed with the royal mark, her name inscribed in permanent ink at the top. "It's yours," he said. "Not granted, not loaned, not subject to any lord's review. Yours, in perpetuity, and any children after you." Her eyes burned. She pressed the deed against her chest and felt the paper crinkle, and thought of her father laying receipts flat by candlelight, and thought of a 12-year-old girl who'd asked why he kept them all. "Because someday, someone might try to tell you this isn't yours." "You put it in my name," she whispered. "Of course I did." His thumb traced her jaw. "It was always yours, Ivy." She kissed him again, standing in the doorway of her father's mill with flour dust on her lips and a deed pressed between their chests. The candles in every window blazed, the mill wheel turned. The creek ran steady and sure over stones that had been there longer than either of them, and would be there long after, and the warmth that lived between them, the flame bond, the fire that didn't burn, settled into something permanent and golden and unshakable. When she pulled back, he was smiling, that quiet, certain smile he only gave her. "Stay for dinner," she said. "I'm making bread." "You're always making bread. And you're always showing up right when it's ready." He laughed, and the sound echoed off the millstones and mixed with the rush of the creek, and Ivy Thornbeck leaned into the chest of the Alpha King of the 5 Kingdoms and felt beneath her ear the steady beat of his heart. His arms came around her. The deed crinkled between them. The flour dust from her hair settled onto the dark green of his coat, and he didn't brush it away. Outside, the mill wheel turned and the creek sang and the candles in every window burned golden and steady, the way they always did now, the way they always would. It sounded like home.